the last portion of the description of what has happened on Earth over the long periods of time, we need to talk about how old the Earth is by the accepted values from radiometric dating. And so we talk about the time periods in terms of billions of years. And so the numerical value is somewhere between 4.5 and 4.6 billion years, depending upon where you look. Now, the textbook that we took this particular information from and from this piece of paper, they're going to describe 4.6 billion as 4,600 million. Okay, that's kind of weird, but a lot of the time periods are in bunches of millions of years, and so that's why they break it down. There are 4,600 million years, and if you multiply those two numbers together, you get 4.6 billion. And so that might be strange, but it does make sense with how they break the time together. Now, I gave you this sheet because the little tiny box in the notes is way too tiny to read. Additionally, along with your half sheet, I'm going to provide this particular sheet for you to use on your exam, which has a little bit of information, okay? And so the time periods are divided into eras, periods, and epochs. Now, you may have heard something about the eras and maybe even some of the periods. The epochs, the subdivisions, are for the more recent time periods, and those aren't really described as well in other texts. So eras and periods are really what we want to kind of look at. Here's what actually is amazing, though, is that we have 4,600 chunks of millions of years, and we know a lot of information from 570 million years ago till now, which leaves 4,030 million years where we don't know a lot. So I know a little amount of time, a lot about a little, and the majority of the amount of time I know almost nothing, because there's not a lot of evidence that is there. And so that is kind of amazing. And here we see a collection that goes from here to here. That's a lot of information, which represents that amount of time. And here we have some information that represents that little amount of time. And here we have quite a bit of information, and that represents here. But from this point all the way to the beginning of the Earth, we know this tiny little amount. Okay? So when we describe things, we're not describing much of the history because we just don't know a lot. And so the eras you must know, and in order. The oldest period is called the Precambrian time. It makes up most of the time chunk. And it's Precambrian because it comes before the Cambrian. Then we have the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, and the Cenozoic era. And the things that you might understand about that: the Mesozoic era is called the age of the dinosaurs. This is where we will talk about them as being dominant. And the Cenozoic is the age of the mammals, or the time period in which mammals are dominant, and where we begin historical records for ourselves. All right. We will break up into different periods, and what I want you to know are the main themes for each one of these. And what happens is we change from one to the next when we see the emergence or the evidence of something relatively brand new in the fossil record. So something pops up that doesn't look like something in the past, okay? And that's where we make division lines. And so, Precambrian time, the one thing that we do know, and that's kind of an oddball thing, is that as early as we can go back, or as far as we can go back, we see evidences of biological life in some of the oldest rock. Now, the life that was there were single cell type of life, but it seemed that life on the face of the earth was here very shortly after the rock hardened. It didn't take that much time for life to actually be found. And we also see that the late Cambrian, we start seeing animals inside the water that are called invertebrates. And that's a level of complexity where the animal lives in something hard and they're protected by an outer shell. They have no vertebrae or bones on the inside. Okay? And so invertebrates, sometimes shells, sometimes not, and we still have bacteria. At this moment in time, we know that plate tectonics have been moving, and so we believe we have had supercontinents form and break apart. And there are upwards of 6 or 8 different supercontinents that are not Pangea that have been proposed. But the evidences for those are a little bit less than you might want to expect. All right, so we move into the next era, and this is where we get the first big change. The Cambrian, we start seeing invertebrates that have shells, and these are in water. Okay? Originally, we believe that the Earth's atmosphere was made up of methane and hydrogen and ammonia. Absolutely no oxygen. And that is very different than what we have today. But in that, we also had water. And so, if we have no oxygen in the atmosphere, we have no ozone layer. If we have no ozone layer, UV rays get down to the earth and on the land, and life gets destroyed by that energy. Only when there is oxygen and ozone is it safe for biological entities to be above the water. The water itself will absorb ozone, and so the safe place on the face of the earth at this early time, it is believed to be under the water. And so that's where we first see life. The next change that is pretty significant is that we start seeing a different species, and we identify them as fish. What really is the difference is they start to have bone structure and they have vertebrae. And so there's a lot of fish that appear, and that's the next particular division. We continue to have the shelled invertebrates, we continue to have fish, but the next phase is we start seeing plants that are on top of the land. Now, plants can and need the UV rays and the light energy to come and hit them to allow photosynthesis to occur. Okay? And so being on land for plants is not as bad as animals. We also see coral reefs that are starting to form. All right. In the place where there's the Precambrian time through the Cambrian, what's happening is the amount of bacteria that are being produced are taking in sunlight, taking in carbon dioxide, and what they are giving off as waste product is oxygen. And so during these times, we are converting the atmosphere, because of life, to a oxygen type of atmosphere, which is an oxidative environment rather than the reductive environment where the other reactants, the other gases were. And so we've created oxygen. We're starting to build that ozone layer. We get plants on the land. The next jump is two things. Okay, forests become abundant, and then we start getting amphibians. Does anybody know what amphibians? What are the characteristics of an amphibian? They what? They can lay eggs, yes. They live on land and water. And so part of their reproductive and life cycle is in water, but part of their life cycle is on land. And so what happened is all life was in the water, and then it starts to move on to land, but not completely. I got to be in water a little bit, and then I move on, and then I go back. And so the first animals that reach the land live part of the time there and part of the time in water. And so that's a pretty big change in what we find in the fossil record. The Carboniferous period, we have large non-flowering plants, lots of swamps. We get much larger amphibians, and the new species is shark. And so shark is a very ancient species that has undergone little change over long periods of time. In terms of what we think about the land, we know that at this point in time, we are starting to have the continents come together. We haven't gotten to Pangaea yet, but they are colliding. The next change, we start to see reptiles and insects. Oh, joy, joy. Okay. But amphibians then are related to reptiles in the logic of, and if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective. Okay. At the end of the Paleozoic era, between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, we have an extinction event where the majority of life dies away. There is a lot of diversity that is lost. Okay? And then it almost seems to start over. Now, we don't start from scratch. We do have complex animals, so it does go faster than what it was before. This moment in time, Pangaea seems to be complete. We start seeing the first dinosaurs and the first mammals. They come on the scene about the same time. The dinosaurs will then lead to, that's the Triassic period. The Jurassic period is the introduction of birds. This is the time period where the dinosaurs are the largest fraction of animals on the face of the earth. And at this moment in time, we start to break apart Pangaea. All right. In terms of evolutionary connections, reptiles into dinosaurs, dinosaurs into birds. If you take a look at the fossils of dinosaurs and the fossils of birds, a lot of the bone structure are very similar. Birds have hollow bones, so do many of the dinosaurs. The shape of their pelvises and a lot of structural components are very, very similar between the two types of animals. And so we enter in birds in Jurassic, and we have the largest dinosaurs. All right. It takes all the way up to the Cretaceous before we even see plants that bring flowers. So it's kind of a not as colorful before that. We also see during this period the dinosaurs are tending to die. The idea is that as Pangaea broke apart, there's a lot of tectonic movement, there's a lot of volcanoes, and a lot of stuff was getting into the air, blocking the sun, preventing lots of plants from eating. And as my daughters watch this all the time, Land Before Time, all the tree stars were going away, or there wasn't enough plant material to keep the growth going. All right. Then we see evidences that the dinosaurs were fading, but there's a line right here at 65 million years where, again, a secondary or another mass extinction where a majority of the plants and animals seem to become extinct in a very short period of time. And the video talked about, and we'll talk about the meteor strike that we believe occurred at that moment in time. At that time, the shift from dinosaurs and mammals, or reptiles, which rely quite a bit on the sun to heat them and to allow them to have energy. For a long time, people have classified dinosaurs as cold-blooded, although the video talks about something called lukewarm-blooded. They can't operate. What they can't do is take their food and create heat and energy enough to keep them moving, whereas mammals could. And so during the time where the Earth was under stress, the mammals became much more advantaged, and so the mammals become dominant. And then in this little tiny period, we start making really obscure, very defined differences. And we are separating all of the land masses to what we see today. The ice and ages occur during this period of time. We see lots of different developments of animals and the rise of humans. And now we are dominant within the ecosystem, and that is the most recent form. And so lots of data here versus what we see down in these areas. In this, really what you need to know about the Precambrian time is that the Precambrian time has rocks that are present that we can identify. We see sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rocks, which indicates that the processes of the tectonic plates have been moving from the beginning of what we believe is the hard crust. We have lots of examples of very old rock centered around Canada and US. Another place that has a lot of it is Australia also. And the other thing that you need to know is that life has been on the face of the Earth in the rock layers almost to the beginning of the time period of Earth. And so life was here very, very early. Biologically, the bacteria, the cyanobacteria, monocellular organisms, are growing in the oceans, and they could convert the CO2 into, and the water into oxygen. And so this is the first time we see life having a climate change. This would be an extreme climate change. And so by about 100 or 1,900 million years ago, you start seeing evidences of life that had more than one cell and organisms that required oxygen for them to survive. We start seeing a lot more fossils in the Paleozoic. And so again, Cambrian, you need to know we have marine invertebrates that have shells. The formation of fish. Following that, we have plants on the land and coral reefs in the ocean. That was the big change. After that, we have the introduction of amphibians is the biggest piece of this. Animals related to frogs and salamanders. Again, we see a lot of fish. Now, it could be that we see a lot of fish because that's where fossils are formed under the ocean, or it's just because there were a lot there. It is debated about how significant, or are we missing fossils because creatures on land form fossils much less readily. The Carboniferous is really important because we had a lot of plants and swamps, and the land was warm, and it seemed like all over the Earth it tended to be swamp-like. Large amphibians and sharks are introduced at this period in time. The Permian, we introduce the reptiles, and one of the keys about reptiles is that they lay their eggs on land. They lay their young in eggs on land, and then we see the beginning of insects. At the end of this period, we see that intense tectonic activity occurs, and we have a lot of species that become extinct. Now, Coal and petroleum are what are called fossil fuels. They are fuels that were made in fossil layers. And coal is the burying of plants in the absence of oxygen, and then they are heated. So they are really sedimentary if they're just buried, but if it gets too hot, it actually can become metamorphic. And basically what is left is just carbon, and it's an organic substance that can be burned, and we burn it a lot for energy. Petroleum, on the other hand, is bacteria that is trapped under the layers, and that bacteria gets cooked and pressurized, and the terminology is cracked into oil, and if there were even higher temperatures, we get gas and even natural gas. On 2 separate occasions, I've been called by the Bradley County paper to ask how much gas a dinosaur would create when it was fossilized, and every time I had to tell them none. No gas and no oil have come from dinosaurs. They were either plants or bacteria is where we get that from. The Mesozoic era, age of the reptiles, the Triassic, Jurassic, and the Mesozoic. We start seeing the introduction of dinosaurs, and most likely from reptiles. The first mammals were warm-blooded, and it's really kind of confusing about where they actually come from. Are they coming from reptiles, a different evolutionary process from that? That's still kind of debated about where the mammals came from first. But mammals tend to have larger brains to mass ratio than either dinosaurs or reptiles. The dinosaurs are at their peak in the Jurassic, and we start to get birds. We believe that's from the dinosaur. The crustaceous, flowering plants, is the first thing that we see, and then the dinosaurs are dying out. And 65 million years ago, we had all dinosaurs die off, and 70% of all life dies off at that time. For a long time, it was debated about why that is, but if you dig down to layers that are at 65 million years ago, what people found were the element iridium. Iridium is IR, number 77 on the periodic table. It is very rare on the face of the Earth, but is found quite often in space. And so the theory now is that a very large meteor hit on the Yucatan Peninsula, created a very large crater. We don't see that crater now because of erosion, but when that hit, it decimated that meteor, hit the crust, put a lot of dust in the air, and so all that iridium from the meteor is now floating around in the dust. It goes across the world and falls down over a period of time, and so every place on Earth in the layer of building sedimentary rock would have evidences of this very high concentration of iridium that is higher than any other layer that we have on the Earth's surface. The death that comes is not necessarily from the strike itself. It isn't the wave of energy that happened at the strike, but it is the blocking of the sun. So all of that dirt and dust in the sky prevents sun from coming down, prevents the plants from growing, and it messes up the entire circle of life in terms of not enough plants for the little animals, not enough little animals for the big animals, and so everybody starved to death at that moment in time. The idea, though, that the meteor did it all, really they believe that there was already a lot of material in the air because there was a lot of volcanic activity. Again, this is the time where we have Pangea breaking apart, and so there was already an extinction event beginning. This kind of just tipped it to tip the scales. The age of the mammals, the Cenozoic area. What we see here is a couple things. The continents seem to have shifted well above the ocean. We don't have a lot of shallow seas that we saw in the past. The climates include really kind of wide zones of hot and cold, humid and dry, versus past climates. And we have a fairly widespread volcanic activity. And so there's something particularly different about the Cenozoic era. And so here's a place where I want to introduce one creation topic that is kind of a little bit of why we might see the kinds of climates before and after the flood. All right, in Genesis, right at the beginning, when he moves upon the deep, then he starts talking about moving and separating the waters. And he separates the waters from below and above. And so, and he called the ones above heaven. And it's a little kind of confusing, that terminology, what is there. And if you read different translations, it really kind of gets even a little bit more confusing. But there is a theory, and it's based upon this. If everything rained right now, we wouldn't put enough water on the face of the earth to flood, okay? And so the theory goes like this, and it's called the vapor canopy theory. And that when God first separated the waters, some of the water was placed in a vapor barrier around the earth, okay? And then some of the water was separated to create the land and the ocean in Genesis 1. If that were true, okay, what you would do is you would create a wonderful greenhouse effect, and a lot more energy would be trapped under that water vapor, okay, which could make the entire Earth from pole to pole, the equator on, a very tropical-like state, kind of like a well-insulated greenhouse, like a garden of Eden, in which there's lots of growth that is happening, okay? In that, if that were true, okay, there's a couple other things about before the flood. Several verses in the Bible actually allude to this, that before the flood, there was absolutely no rain. The fields were watered by the dew of the morning, and rain was something that was brand new at the flood time. All right. If there was a water vapor canopy above us, all right, you would have a lot of protection in terms of the temperature being constant, but you would also have a huge amount of protection against UV energies and things that are coming from the sun. And so, if you look at the lifespans of the people described in the Bible before the floods, how long did they live? Hundreds of years, right? And then immediately after the flood, our lifespans went to, I mean, if you got to 100, that was spectacular. We're not talking 900 of Methuselah. We're talking, God gave us 20 score plus 10 or 70 years. Something dramatically happened differently in terms of the ages of the people before and after the flood. If the water vapor canopy was there, blocking all of these bad energies coming from the sun, that could slow down aging, slow down those kinds of things that might be harmful to us. And when the flood happened, when it described the flood actually happening, how long was the flood? It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay? Also, it describes not just rain, but it said waters coming from under and above. So there were other waters that were being released at that time. This is a period in which that vapor canopy could have been doused on the earth, where it was there originally, and if you talk about it, he moved upon the void and it was covered in all water, and now it's coming back. And so the raining or the water coming down lasted for 40 days and nights, but they were on the ark for a lot longer. And it's estimated up to at least a year, if not over a year, that they were on the ark. And you know the story of Noah sending out the birds, trying to find, and until the dove came back with a branch, then he knew it was safe. And so the flood actually occurred over a much longer period of time than we really believe. And so in that, you put a lot of water, you do a lot of mixing. You could adjust and move things around during that period of time. And so the flood could solve a lot of issues in terms of what we see. Okay? But then there has to be the draining away. Where did the water go? We haven't necessarily found a place for that. The Bible doesn't actually talk about where the excess water went. But after the flood and now in this period, it seems our continents are much, much higher than they used to be, than what it looked historically. And so maybe the flood was what made, and the process that actually occurred, pushed the continents higher than what we see today. And so the Cenozoic era versus all the rest of them seem to be a dividing line that could be paralleled to before and after the flood in terms of what we see. And so, has anybody ever been to the Ark exhibit? I actually went. My parents live in Kentucky, and it's right up the road there. It's spectacular looking. You walk up to it, and it's much larger than you could ever think. You never know what a cubit is until they actually, you see the big thing there. The only thing that really kind of got me, though, was there was more talk about dinosaurs in that exhibit than just about anything else. They wanted to really convince you that there were dinosaurs on the face of the earth. Okay? This would occur because we see fossilization of dinosaurs, and so if we believe in a very young earth and the creation 6,000 years ago, then dinosaurs and man must be coexisting. Okay? Is there any place in the Bible that you might believe that it refers to dinosaurs? One is Leviathan. There's one more. There was, what was that? Yeah, they're in Job. Both the references are in Job, which we believe is the oldest book in the Bible. But they talk about an animal that has a leg that's like a tree trunk. And so there are two references to large animals. And so Leviathan, a big creature of the sea, okay, could be a dinosaur. It could also be referring to a whale. To our perspective, those are both big. A blue whale could be described as a Leviathan. And then in terms of an animal that has a leg is like a tree of the trunk, that sounds just like a dinosaur. Or an elephant, yes. And so that descriptive language can be interpreted different ways. What it really is, because it didn't actually articulate exactly what it was. And so from a young Earth's perspective, they have to be both together, coexisting, or you have to have created an old Earth that had dinosaurs in the layers, never existing, but had evidences that they might have been there in the past. And from an evolutionary model, they are very far apart, never to actually interact. And so that's a big dividing line. Here is one problem I do have with the idea that God created a universe that looked old. Okay? Paul writes in the New Testament that even in nature that you can see, and the evidence of God and even Jesus Christ and his redemption can be seen in nature. And when I look at and think about God, I believe that we can see his hand in nature, and it points back to him. And I personally believe that God doesn't lie. And so if God is going to make a creation, it should reflect exactly his nature. And so to make an argument that God is going to make something that looks old when it is young, to me is a little hollow, in that God's nature is to reveal himself, not to confuse the issue and make something look something that doesn't exist. And so I believe that the nature that is presented reflects exactly what he is and what he created. I would never take the stance that God created in a way to trick us. And some people truly believe that that's how you can explain why everything looks old. That just doesn't ring true with me. We see a lot of mountain building occurring in this time period that we're in, and so lots of the most recent and very highest mountains were created relatively recently, and even the older mountain ranges were pushed up. After the mass extinction of the Mesozoic era, mammals had the advantage, especially when it was cooler and a lot less food. In terms of dinosaurs, if you allow a reptile to have energy and food, they continue to grow. And they can grow very, very big. The limit is really how much food that they had. And so if you were under perfect conditions, some dinosaurs could have been examples of reptiles that were allowed to grow over long periods of time with lots and lots of food. But in the time period where there was, if there's a challenge to a growing food, then animals can die off, and that's an issue. At this point in time, it gets really sketchy in terms of a lot of people look at this, and this is where you really get kind of on edge in terms of the evolutionary process that would produce humans, in terms of the relationships between apes and man. The idea is that 6 million years ago, there was a divergence between ape and man. There were lots of human-like species. They're overlapping, but not all of them exist, and they're not continuous. And so there were spurts of development, and some died off. Some actually were existing. So the Neanderthal, things of that, those types of species may have not been exactly in our past, but a parallel development. That's the idea evolutionarily. About 2.4 million years ago, the first true, what they believe, descendant for Homo sapiens is developed. And really, the thinking within an evolutionary model is that only the Homo sapiens itself only a few 100,000 years old in terms of the ideas. All right, and so this is where, obviously, when you look at the creation story and the creation of Adam and Eve, particularly as the human race, this is where the contention comes quite a bit in the record. All right, here is this tree here, okay? The trees of evolution. It is, and developed all the way back from Darwin, there is a belief that everything is related. And so you can relate different species by what they look like. And so people drew relationships by, well, if this is close and this is close and that one could become this one and this one could become that one. And they made these elaborate drawings about how they're all related. And this is a representation of that same thing. And so, okay, you can be related by look. And for a long time, that's how people thought about how you change over small things over long periods of time to change things. That whole relationship between animals and species was put on its head when you aren't just looking at the shapes of what you find, but we start looking at the DNA, the instructions of how we're made. And when they redid the entire maps of how things are related by DNA, the maps were almost completely right. There were a couple things that were different, which they may have looked similarly, but their DNA were different. And we can trace different changes over time, and it looks really convincing. Only small changes in the DNA, the strands of 3 billion base pairs, they're little changes that are really common, and it looks like one came from the other. All right? The fact that they look similarly can be interpreted two different ways. It can be interpreted that there was one thing and then they diverged and they made new things. Another way to look at it is when you look at the structure of how everything is, when you look at the DNA of all these things that are alive, what you can see is common design. And if God created one to work and the other one had to work very similarly, why not use the same pattern for one and the other and change little things? And so the fact that they are related in terms of what they look like, it is your belief about how you interpret that data. And so common design can be the fact, or divergence over long periods of time. Same data, two different perspectives that you start with before you even interpret that data. The chapter that was in the book and that we base this on talks about, okay, over the period of time, we have had a small population all over the face of the earth, and very recently that has changed. Our rate of reproduction has skyrocketed in a very short period of time. Okay, at the time of the first printing, when this form was made, it was a little over 6 billion. We're over 7 billion, heading towards 8 billion people on the face of the earth right now. In actuality, there's more people on the face of the earth right now than if we took all historical numbers of everybody that was there. We have more people living now than we have in all of the past. And so, here is the deal. We are growing and we are needing more and more resources, but the earth doesn't get any bigger, and there are only limited number of resources. And so, we're going to do one of two things, all right, from a humanistic perspective. That we're going to grow, and then we're going to become enlightened in some way, and we're going to find a way to balance between our resources and our needs, and we are going to find a perfect balance and level off. Another way to look at it is we're going to come to a point where we are competing for resources, and there is only a finite amount, and we're going to find a level not through peace but through disease, war, and we will lose population and only be able to survive at a certain level. Now, I do like the dotted line, because I know that at some point in time in this period of time, regardless of where it is, that Jesus is coming back. There will be a rapture. There will be a judgment. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And all of it will pass away and it will become new.